We're glad you could join us today for our Words Matter series in today's episode. Words matter. Words change the tone, the frame, and behavior, and words can change practice. The adage of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me isn't really true, because words can hurt, but they can also heal. Welcome to the Words Matter series, where we engage in open and authentic discussions about the impact of common terminology that's used in child serving systems with those that are directly affected. Our goal is to illuminate how the terms we use can influence perception, approach, and practice, as well as explore alternative language as a means of intentionally shifting how we view and interact with youth, families, and with each other. Today, we'll be exploring the term mental illness or mentally ill. But before we begin, let's take a minute and consider this term. Think about what comes to mind when you think of mental illness or mentally ill. And using the link that's in the chat box, please respond to the Menti poll with the thoughts and perceptions that come to mind when you hear this term. Okay. I see some people putting them in the chat box. If you're able, go to www.menti.com and use the code that you see on the screen. There we go. What this is going to show us is a word cloud. And the most common terms that people put in, or common perceptions, will show up in larger font. Give everybody a minute to be able to log on and do this. I did see some that were in the chat. Person struggling with day-to-day decisions or emotions, having a diagnosis, unstable, unbalanced, fragile, weak. These are some of the things that are showing up in chat. Okay. Fragile is one that several people have used because that's showing up in a larger font. Depressed. Oh, crazy. Yeah. Yeah, that seems to be, in the general population, that's somewhat of a term that's used when we're talking about someone who has a behavioral health issue. Someone struggling, not understood, sick. Are there others? I like that someone put ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. That definitely can exacerbate and lead to some struggles as you're older. Feels alone, isolated, trauma. Okay. Struggle is showing up as a common term, but still, I think the middle crazy. Wow. Okay, thank you. Joanne, we can stop with that one now. Thank you for participating in that. Let's talk about how this term impacts youth and families. Joining us today are Sawyer Keegan, a youth leader and No Quiet organizer in Massachusetts, and Regina Kreider, who's a parent and a family leader from the Youth and Family Alliance in Illinois. I really thank you both for being here and for sharing your experiences and your perspectives with us. Let's start with this term. The term mental illness refers to health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking, or behavior, and they impact an individual's functioning in social, work, or family activities. Mental illness is common and it doesn't discriminate. It takes many forms and it may be mild all the way up to having severe symptoms. The term is used quite often in the behavioral health field, in the media, and by the public with different connotations, sometimes factual, sometimes negative, sometimes derogatory. It definitely still carries a stigma, although it's part of the whole health of a person. Those experiencing emotional or behavioral health challenges themselves, or supporting a child or youth with these challenges, may define this term differently based on their lived experiences in service systems and public settings. So, Regina, from a parent perspective, what does the term mental illness or mentally ill mean to you?
First of all, I want to thank you, Millie, for inviting me to be a part of this. This is super exciting. But I don't think I realized until I started preparing for the program that I cringe at that word, mentally ill or mental illness. I don't think I really realized that until today. But in my mind, that phrase has so many negative and stigmatizing connotations that's connected to it. And especially for me, in regards to my experiences in the Black community from my childhood, because those words, when I think of that, it's connected to words like unstable, nutty, crazy, insane, unbalanced, mental, loony. So it wasn't until you actually brought this forward that I didn't realize that it was really a negative and stigmatizing word in my mind. So that's what it means to me. It's cringy.
Yeah, and as a parent
Yes.
of a child or children who have had some struggles, I mean, it does make you kind of cringe because someone's talking about your kid,
Yeah, when I think about it from the perspective of thinking about it, and I'm at liberty to utilize my daughter's name, we are in agreement that when we talk about mental health and I come on as a parent, that there will be times I'll share her story. And so I just want everyone to know that I do have permission to share. But I think about my daughter and her journey and thinking of someone calling her mentally ill, or I think that would really be offensive to me. So definitely as a parent, it's a word that that is has some negative connotations connected to it.
Yeah. Now, Sawyer, from a young adult perspective, what does the term mental illness or mentally ill mean to you?
So what Regina was saying really resonated with me. It definitely does give me this kind of cringe feeling. But it also gives a sense of wrongness. And it definitely made me feel like I was fundamentally wrong. One thing that stood out while you were speaking was the phrase mild to severe, which is something as an autistic person I have been battling for a really long time, is this concept of mild to severe. In the mental health world, it means something completely different. And while it means something completely different, it also has the same undertones to it, which are what is more palatable to society. And looking at that, if you look at it that way, it really just is kind of terrifying and not something you think about when you think about treatment. If you're trying to tell someone in a therapy session, like, this is what you need to do to be palatable to society, like, they're not going to listen to you. They're going to be like, what are you talking about? Go away.
Mhm.
But when you're saying, oh, your autism is mild, therefore you're not as whatever as the next person, or your mental illness is less severe, it's less impactful. That's essentially just saying you're more palatable to society than the next person in line. And when you hear it that way, you kind of feel disgusted, even if you are someone who is less severe. And
It's a little
I
dismissive.
think it's really
isn't it?
important. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't heard anyone put it in that way before, being palatable to society. And that does make me, ooh, I don't know. That doesn't feel good at all.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm wondering, for both of you, because you also work in the field, you advocate, you volunteer, you lead. Does this mean anything differently in your role as a youth or a family leader?
When I was thinking about this question, to be honest, I don't believe I've ever used the term mental illness or mentally ill in my role as a family leader. Personally, I find the word off-putting. That's just my personal opinion and own feeling. But once again, that's steeped in my own personal experiences. And when I thought about it more, I couldn't imagine talking to one of my peers or a family that I'm supporting and saying that they're, utilizing the terminology mentally ill or mental illness, or for anyone to say that to me, I would be probably really horrified. Like I said, I had never thought about this before, Millie, to be honest, this particular phrase. I've thought about a lot of phrases, but this was not one of them. And to me, it feels insensitive and off-putting. So I don't define it any differently because it's not something that I utilize in the circles I move in around children's mental health and working with families. It's just not a terminology that I utilize at all.
Mhm. Thank you. Sawyer, do you define it any differently or even use the term in your work as a leader?
So I have had to, in a lot of situations, use this phrasing. Unfortunately, because a lot of young adults that I work with are very by the book in the sense that they want to get everything right. By the book is the wrong phrase, I'm sorry. Very particular about their language and want to make sure they're doing the right thing.
Mhm.
So when it came to diagnoses, they were like, I want to make sure I have a diagnosis before I can jump in the neurodivergent chat.
Mhm.
And it became a really difficult thing for me to wrap my head around that, like, some people need these diagnoses. Some people need them not in the sense that they need them to be treated or just that they need them to be treated, but also that they need them to feel validated. And working past that can be a process that I went through and was really hard for me. It can also be a process that's really quick and just, I don't want anything to do with these labels.
Mhm.
But as someone who grew up with psychiatry in my life consistently, I started therapy at age 4.
Oh,
It's
this is
almost
Adelanite.
impossible.
I'm
It
sorry.
is almost impossible for me to avoid the word mental health and mental illness and a lot of the things that I do because I know that through that I'd be dismissing so many people. Because while it isn't the ideal phrasing, it's the phrasing some people have to use to get through the day.
Mhm. Yeah, that
And
makes
it's the phrasing you have to use for accommodations.
Mhm. Yeah. And actually that leads right into, my next question about the impact. You both have talked a little bit about that, but I had not thought about it before as it can be to say, okay, now I have been diagnosed with a mental illness, it validating because it does name something that you may be feeling or going through that you haven't had a name for. Or like you said, that there may be a sense of belonging so that you can move into a space with others who are experiencing similar things. And it's like, oh, okay, now I'm with people who get what I'm talking about. The way in which a term is used can impact people differently. And, it's used frequently these days in lots of different settings. You hear mental illness, in our work settings, in our private lives. You see it in the media, portrayed different ways. When and how it's used can change how the term affects you. And you highlighted a couple of those things. What are some of the other impacts that you've seen or experienced yourself when this term is used, or used in your community? You've hit on a couple of them, but either one of you want to respond to that?
So in the area where I live at, it's the community, there's been a lot of effort and a lot of work in this area in Champaign County around mental health awareness. And I think so. I would think that people are pretty aware and involved. But the times that I do hear the terminology mental illness or mentally ill typically are associated with adult systems, sometimes specifically the adult justice system in our community. I hear it frequently utilized. And then also referring to some of the homeless population as well is also when I hear it. When speaking of adults who are learning to deal with homelessness, when we hear about sometimes gun violence or mass shootings, you hear that terminology. And so I think that it impacts us in how we look at people, depending on what setting or if there has been an event that has taken place and how it's utilized. And that begins to shape and frame our thought process around certain types of people or connecting a specific behavior with that particular phrase. And a lot of times is not very positive. So that's how I've seen it show up and how it has impacted our community, which then adds to the stigma of mental health and the challenges that we face with it. I think that being in the family realm gives me a little bit more liberty to say that there's certain words that we just won't use. And I think that that's really one of the really freeing parts of being a part of the family movement and being representative as a parent, saying, okay, this is how we want to be spoken to and spoken about, and this is how we want our children to be spoken to and spoken about, that type of thing. So I think that the impact is broad, but it shows up differently in each system or situation.
Mm-hmm. In different settings, it's used in different ways.
Absolutely.
Like in a family group, it may not be used at all. But if you're in a training or if you're in a mental health center, you may hear that more often.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, how do you see this impacting people, in your community? And how's it impacted you when it's used?
So a lot of folks who are younger and enter the mental health system when they are younger, their families tend to either completely reject it, or they tend to do everything they can to try to support this child. And so for me, because it made me feel so fundamentally sick and wrong, but also just the behaviors I was engaging in were so drastic at that time because I was feeling so fundamentally wrong. and there was also a lot of other factors, but it made me and my family kind of believe that the only way I could be healed was a doctor professional. And that was a very strict category at the time. So when I think of mental illness, that's an illness. You go to a doctor for an illness. You don't go to a peer. That's not what you do. Whereas peer support has been the major thing that's pulled me out of the trauma and harm that I've endured by the hands of professionals that I was brought to believe was okay. And it was bringing me to believe that my parents, at the time, I would believe that they felt like they were doing the right thing and I was still struggling, which was true. But it made me feel really hopeless.
Mhm. Yeah, you said something that you've said it once before too in this conversation, that being referred to as having a mental illness or being mentally ill just makes you feel like you're wrong. There's something wrong with you. And I think that's part of the connotation that goes along with this particular term. I try to use behavioral health. That's the one I prefer, just myself when I'm talking about my children. They do have behavioral health challenges. But it's really the whole people. We're still separating the mind from the rest of the body, even though the mind runs the rest of the body. It's such a conundrum to me. It's so interesting. Um, so we know that there's lots of other things we can use. Like I said, I use behavioral health. That's the term that feels better to me. Physical and behavioral health. But there are other ways to describe and document, the challenges that our youth, our young adults, our families struggle with when we're talking about emotional and behavioral health. And there are lots of other ways to say this and other terms to use, other approaches to use that really consider the youth and family experience and their expertise. So is there alternative language or specific approaches, perspectives that you would encourage people to use that are closer to what your experience is and is more respectful of what that is?
I know for me and for for a lot of people, utilizing the terminology mental health disorders, I'm okay with that. That works for me. Mental health challenges is also acceptable as far as I'm concerned. And then I also, especially when I'm talking about children and especially in a school setting, the social emotional development of a child, I think that those are very acceptable. And also, and once again, let me also say this, Millie, and I want to just throw this in. As a person who is not only just I'm a parent of a child with mental health disorders and challenges, I also serve as a pastor. And so this has been a huge issue within the church is to talk about this. And I hope it's okay for me to just plug this in for a second, is to talk about how important it is in terminology in a in the faith community and how we talk about mental health and mental health disorders. And it's so important because it can push people or drive people to help, get help. And like I said, in the African American community, one of the places that we go for help in a lot of cases is the church. And
Mhm.
so how we talk about it is really important as well. And so once again, this terminology is a critical piece to being able to get people connected and helping them along the way to get to the services that are going to be helpful. But if you don't know how to talk about it in a way that's going to speak to people's heart, and you're utilizing terminology that is maybe offensive or hurtful or dated, then it can put that barrier. And so this is one of those great conversations that help to break down that stigma, break down those barriers. But once again, I like the terminology mental health challenges. That's typically what I use when I talk about my daughter. Social emotional development, and also mental health disorders.
You know, you bring up the fact that there are cultural aspects to this. And a lot of people do turn to their faith-based community. And so our faith leaders, leaders in general, but particularly our faith leaders, the terminology they use, the way in which they refer to someone who may be struggling with a behavioral health issue or challenge, which is a whole other thing. Is it a challenge? Is it an issue? But it can impact someone's life, you know, just by hearing something on a Sunday or a Saturday night, you know, it you know, from the person that you look to for guidance,
right,
can make a huge difference. And how it's actually defined within your community, because different cultures, different ethnic groups define it and address it differently.
right.
And that also impacts the ability to, or someone's desire, willingness to seek treatment. And if so, what kind and where?
Yep.
You know, does it fit their culture? So yeah,
Right.
that's such a good point.
And when my daughter, I remember the first time my daughter was hospitalized, and I was standing in the pulpit, and I was looking out at the congregation for the first time, and I kept thinking to myself, I am not the only family that is going through this. I can't possibly be the only family that's going through this. And then it made me begin to recount a lot of interactions and exchanges of things that I've heard people say in the pulpit, and refer to people as crazy and this, as loony or off their rockers. And I'm thinking, we definitely have to change this. Not only do we have to change it in the community, we have to change it in the places where families show up, because this is very critical. And so I have put in a lot of work, especially at my church, and in opportunities that I have to speak with other people in the faith community about the significance of changing how we approach this from a faith perspective. Thank you for the opportunity to share that part.
Yeah, that it's very important in other settings. I'm just thinking going to the pediatrician's office with my youngest child, and that pediatrician saying, your child said something that, can we explore that a little bit further? And because she saw my whole child, not just that we were there for a rash, or something like that. She also saw some symptoms of anxiety and some symptoms of depression, and treating the whole child. And I was so thankful to have a pediatrician that recognized those things and included it with, this is your well-being. We're just talking about who you are and keeping you healthy. Didn't make a difference.
Exactly.
Didn't refer to it as a mental illness, or as, as Soria said, my child didn't feel like something was wrong with them with that approach. And it made a huge difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, go ahead.
I said 100%. I agree.
Sawyer, what would you suggest as really better approaches or different terms to use? What do you hear from your peers as well?
So I have been in the queer community for quite some time now. And within that, I have found a number of peers who started using the term mad to define themselves. And it wasn't something that I thought of quickly as, oh, this is me, or oh, this is something I want to use in my day-to-day life. But the more I looked into it, the more I found that it actually fits my lived experience. So the term mad is actually empowering for me. It gives back power to folks who, like I said, have lived experience of being oppressed in systems, who feel voiceless and helpless. Particularly, it refers to those directly who are against the principles of psychiatry and psychology, most of which are what intentionally drives me to the feelings that I've discussed today. Some of the foundational principles of psychology are that we should be individuals, independent individuals, and that just doesn't work. And so it calls for peer support, community care, and overall autonomy. It calls for consent in the treatment setting. And it not only refers to people who are just against psychiatry and psychology, but specifically those folks who are experiencing things that in today's world would require them to seek out psychiatric care. So folks like myself who would be told they're mentally ill. There are quite a number of other things other words that are being reclaimed. The word queer is a big one of them. And this is, in my mind, just another reclamation of a word that is a little bit less popular right now than it overall should be. But the peer support movement has really helped me see that there isn't something fundamentally wrong with me. And the term mad has shown me that there is something wrong with the systems that set up an environment in which I can't just be my authentic self, and I have to become palatable to society.
Okay. So it sounds like one of the approaches that you would advocate for is really asking a person, or just being respectful of how a person requests to be referred to, seen, talked to. Really being respectful of us as individuals, but knowing that we can't, we still need that peer support, which is so important. And I think, Regina was doing this when you were talking about the importance of that, because really having someone walk alongside you who has similar experiences can empower you and make you feel less alone and more like, I'm going to get through this. I'm going to find what works for me. Are there other terms besides MAD that you would suggest, or other approaches? As a leader, what do you use?
So I really agree with Regina in the sense of social emotional development is really important phrase. And I also think that the term that my friends and my coworkers and I have been using for quite some time is MMIND, which stands for mad, mentally ill, and neurodivergent. And while it does have mental illness in there, it is in there to encompass folks who feel that they need that to belong. And that's something that I think is really important, is that we don't just dismiss this word, because a lot of people do need it to get by.
Mhm.
it's similar to how a lot of transgender folks need certain apparel to get by before they can do certain things that make them feel more comfortable with their body,
Mhm. I completely understand that.
if that is the route they want to go. Yes.
Yeah,
you.
as the parent of a trans child, that's so true, so very true. And I'm wondering, and this is kind of to both of you. You talked about reclaiming words, and it's other people who have put the connotations that are negative on mental illness, and like you said, MMIND. I hear more and more neurodivergent, um, and it sounds like people are kind of taking back the power that they have in being an individual. We all weren't meant to be the same. I mean, the life would be boring if we were all the same, right? But it doesn't mean that it doesn't define you. It doesn't mean that that's the only part of you is this piece that you're dealing with. And that's something I try to keep in mind. That's not what defines my child or myself. It's maybe a part of who we are. So it's a lot to think about. Is there anything else that you would want to add about this term or about the use? It's blowing up in the chat, which is absolutely great. I love that people are interacting in there.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sawyer, please forgive my ignorance. Can you explain neurodivergent to me, please?
Of course. Thank you so much for asking. I really appreciate that. So neurodivergent is a phrase that is based on the neurodiversity model. So neurodiverse means that everyone on this planet has a different brain structure. That's just fundamentally how human bodies work. And along with that, there are a subset of people who are a little bit further out than the rest of the population and a little bit more diverse. And so that comes into neurodivergent. And so that encompasses usually autism, ADHD, trauma, OCD, and a number of other things that would today be considered disorders, but might not actually need to be disorders if we can get accommodations in place.
Thank you for sharing that with me. I appreciate you sharing that aspect because my daughter is also autistic. And so this, information helps me to know how to better support her with, we don't have as many services and supports and organizations like what you lead in my community. So as I can learn more to help empower her on her journey, the more better it is for her because she's struggling with that piece right now. So just to have a new word, which I love words, to introduce to her is really awesome. So thank you for explaining that to me.
I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate all the work that you do as a parent. And I appreciate that you're doing all of this example setting work and community care work. And that's something that's really close to my heart. I really value that in you. I could ramble on forever, but
Thank you.
thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to just point out something that Austin said in the chat. rather than something to overcome, I prefer to think of my mental health experiences as something to be supported. It's a really good.
You- I was reading an article on the Mighty. I think it's the Mighty. That's the name of the organization, and it had a great article about redefining that terminology of support. And it really has changed the way that I've interacted with my daughter. Instead of saying that she's high functioning, so this once again focuses on words. Instead of saying she's high functioning, it talked about levels of support. And so that has changed just the way that we've approached in dealing with her autism as a young adult, is that she needs more mid-level type of support. She doesn't need, high support. She needs like a more mid support, just having that structure. But that alone just has helped us in our relationship on how she's moving forward in life and growing as a young adult. And so just even phrases, something as simple as that can just change the dynamics of how a youth can grow or a young adult can grow, or me as a mom can help support my child as she's trying to navigate this thing and figure it out as she goes along. So words are so powerful and so meaningful, and it can just change the trajectory of a person's journey.
Absolutely. Hence this whole series. Words do matter. If you want to engage someone, you do need to be intentional in the words that you're using, and think about that and see other perspectives. So that's fantastic. I really want to thank both of you for being here today and for sharing your experiences and perspectives. Your ideas and your suggestions are so valuable because it comes from that place of experience. It's not something that you have heard or assume would work. It really comes from what you've been through. So I appreciate that, and as I said, I value that. Before we go, I would like to return to some of the initial perceptions and thoughts that people expressed about mental illness or mentally ill. That word cloud that we did, where words were showing up as, most used, and it was crazy in the middle. And but now everyone who's listening here, consider what you just heard, and what you've learned through today's discussion with Regina and with Sawyer, and with each other in the chat. Consider that. I want to do one more Menti poll. And I want to ask you, what are some of the things that you are committed to doing within your role to impact how the term mentally ill or mental illness is used or implemented? So again, use that link in the chat box and respond to it. Your responses are going to be shared on the screen, not as a word cloud, but they are going to be rolling. So again, the question is, what are some of the things that you're committed to doing within the role that you have, as a parent, as a community member, as a provider, as a peer supporter, as a supervisor? What are you committed to? If you'll use that link that's in the chat, go to menti.com and use the code that's on the screen, 1631-5359. Okay, here we go. Ask how the person wants me to talk about their mental health. Yeah, when in doubt, ask. I was on a call with a school. I'm a parent representative for the school that my child's a freshman at, and they were talking about culture and why students aren't engaged. And I said, have you asked them why they're not engaged? Have you asked them what would be engaging to them? And they're like, oh, it's a great idea. Obtain a better understanding and be more careful the words I use. Ask people to explain what they mean. Remembering that one term doesn't fit all. That is so true. Changing language I use in documents. That's important. It's not just the words you say. It's in the materials. It's in your intake forms. It is in how you put things out on your website that can make a difference. It looks like the levels of support resonated. Correct others, ask and listen, support bringing forward voices of people with lived experience, yet recognizing that the lived experience is unique, and it's going to change as we develop, as we learn more. You know, we do things differently. These are all great. And I also saw that there were some that were in the chat, which I appreciate as well. Advocate for terminology changes. Absolutely. We had a Words Matter episode on serious emotional disturbance, SED. And that's a term that really we ought to consider. Is there another way to handle that category of supports? Okay. Thank you very much for participating in that second poll. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and we hope that you will also join us next month. Just like this month is Children's Mental Health Awareness Month, so we want to talk about, you know, mental health, mental illness, mentally ill. Next month, June, Pride Month, and we hope that you'll join us for an exploration of the use of preferred pronouns. So in closing, we challenge you to be intentional in using terms that are more supportive and respectful of the youth and family experience and their expertise. So thank you again, and remember that words matter.